everyone, I am Jocelyn Piapi, 12 Aquarius, and today I will discuss to you about the photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be broken down into two stages, the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. The light-dependent reaction occurs inside the thylakoid within the chloroplast. The light-independent reaction, which is basically called as the Calvin cycle or also known as the dark reaction. So, the reason why this is called a light-independent reaction or the dark reaction because they can proceed without the assistance of the light energy. And remember, oxidation involves the loss of electrons. So, whenever an oxidation reaction occurs, there has to be a reductive reaction. So, NADP plus picks up those electrons and reduce it into NADPH. Now, some energy that is transferred by the light is used to make an ATP from ADP plus phosphate. ATP is produced by chemiosmosis using an enzyme called ATP synthase. So these are the products of light-dependent reaction. The oxygen gas, the ATP, and the NADPH. And the reactants are H2O or water, NADP plus, and ADP plus phosphate. The light-independent reaction or the Calvin cycle. The carbon dioxide takes into the Calvin cycle and reduce it into sugar such as glucose. Now, because that's a reductive process, oxidation has to happen somewhere. So, NADPH oxidizes into NADP+. Carbon dioxide ultimately receives those selections and eventually turn it into glucose. ATP is used to power that process as ATP is converted back to ADP plus phosphate. It energizes the Calvin cycle, giving it energy that it needs to convert carbon dioxide into glucose. So the reactants of the Calvin cycle are carbon dioxide, NADPH, and ATP. So what are the products? The products are NADP plus and NADP plus phosphate and sugar.
Now, let's zoom into the light-dependent reaction. This is where pigments such as chlorophyll are found and is where light gets absorbed. The pigments are arranged in clusters called photosystems. Let's start with photosystem 2. When photosystem 2 absorb light, electrons in chlorophyll gain energy or get excited from the light. These excited electrons leave chlorophyll and move to something called electron transport chain. But since chlorophyll lost electrons, those electrons need to be replaced. To replace them, water is split and its electrons go to chlorophyll. When water is split, electrons, hydrogen ions, and oxygen are produced. You probably know that plants makes oxygen when they do photosynthesis. This is where that oxygen comes from. Now, back to electron transport chain. The electron transport chain transport electrons. As it does, the energy in the electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions or protons across the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid. This creates a high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid. These ions would be trapped inside the thylakoid, but a special enzyme called ATP synthase allows them to passively diffuse from the high to low concentration. This flow of hydrogen ions through ATP synthase causes ATP synthase to spin and produce ATP. Similar to how water flowing through a turbine produces power at a hydroelectric dam. This ATP is a key product of a light-dependent reaction. When the electrons reach the end of this first electron transport chain, they go to photosystem, where light excites them again. They travel down a second, shorter electron transport chain where they are accepted by a molecule called NADP+. When it accepts the electrons, it also accepts hydrogen and becomes NADPH. NADPH is an electron carrier and another K-product of the light-dependent reactions. It carries electrons and hydrogens to the next set of reactions in photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle. Both ATP and NADPH are critical products of the light-dependent reactions that are needed to make sugar in the Calvin cycle, which we will examine in our next video.
So today I'll be discussing about the Calvin cycle or the photosynthesis where the Calvin cycle occurs. So the overall purpose of the Calvin cycle is to convert the carbon dioxide to carbohydrates or sugar, which the plant needs to power up its cellular activities and build new plant structures. The Calvin cycle reaction occurs within the stroma of the chloroplast. The reactions use ATP and NADPH produced by the light reaction to convert CO2 to carbohydrate. Now let's zoom in. The Calvin cycle can be divided into three phases: the carbon dioxide fixation, carbon dioxide reduction, and the regeneration of RUPB. Carbon dioxide fixation basically captures the CO2 from the atmosphere so it can be used in the reaction. With this, CO2 is attached to RUPB. The enzyme used in this reaction is called rubisco, and the result of the reaction is an unstable carbon molecule that quickly splits into 2 to 3 carbon molecules, or the 3PG. The process of converting the CO2 to carbohydrates begins. This is called the carbon reduction phase because we are adding the electrons and the energy to the CO2 molecule. During this phase, a sequence of reaction uses NADPH and some of the ATP from the light reactions. These electrons supply the needed electrons and energy for CO2 reduction. Electrons are added from NADPH and there are a series of reactions. 3PG is reduced to form G3P, or carbohydrate. ADP and NADP plus returns to the thylakoids to be converted back to ATP and NADPH by the light reactions. One of the G3P molecules set aside to be used as a building block of glucose, but majority of the G3P molecules proceeds to the third phase of the Calvin cycle. In this phase, ATP is used to combine the G3P molecules to form RUBP molecules. Then RUBP is combined with an additional carbon dioxide to continue the bound molecules. To form a glucose molecule, the cycle has to turn 6 times because each turn of the cycle only adds 1 carbon atom from the incoming carbon dioxide. And lastly, it's important to remember that the Calvin cycle is dependent on the light reactions to provide NADPH and ATP, which is needed to also provide carbohydrates.